Several days ago, on January 24th, an F-35C belonging to the US Navy fell off the deck of the aircraft carrier USS Vinson. US Navy's Lieutenant Mark Langford admitted a day later that the plane impacted the flight deck during landing and then fell into the sea. Now, that could be quite a problem. Not because the Navy lost a plane costing nearly $100 million, but because the F-35C is full of cutting-edge technology. A stealth plane with perhaps the most modern fighter jet radar in the US military, and chock full of other sensitive and advanced avionics. And it slipped into the South China Sea, possibly just hundreds of miles off the coast of mainland China. Given that the USS Vinson was part of an exercise in the Philippine Sea just 2 days earlier, and that it subsequently entered the South China Sea a day before the crash, we can very roughly estimate the plane's location. The carrier is surrounded by ships using up fuel, so its whole group couldn't have sailed quickly to the South China Sea. It's peacetime and there's little reason to rush at 30 knots, wasting fuel. Ship groups almost always sail at much more economical speeds of some 50 knots, give or take. While the carrier could have theoretically sailed through the Philippines, the initial location of the exercise, being described as south of Okinawa, makes that unlikely. For the carrier to sail to the South China via that route, its initial position would have had to be closer to the Philippines than to Okinawa. So the F-35 most likely crashed somewhere here, which is still a huge area. That is not really the issue for the US Navy, of course, as they know exactly where the ship was when the plane crashed. It's possibly not an issue for the Chinese Navy either, as it most likely had no problems tracking a foreign power carrier force in peacetime so close to its shores. It would be almost impossible for the US carrier group to hide from enemy radars in such a location, close to China. That would give China the route of the US carrier, but that alone wouldn't give it information of where the carrier was at the precise moment the plane crashed. Then again, as it is peacetime, China usually trails movements of such foreign ships with ships of their own, from close by. So it's perfectly plausible China could have noticed the moment the plane crashed. If that is true, then China would basically have the same information the US has about the crash. Now, getting the plane out from the sea, especially if the plane is not very damaged, could be quite beneficial to China, which is why the US Navy already stated it is looking into options of recovering the wreckage. As the plane was landing, its speed was not likely great. We also know the pilot ejected, which points to the possibility the impact was not hard, which is corroborated by Lieutenant Langford's statement that the impact to the flight deck was superficial and all equipment for flight operations remained operational. Falling to the sea as it tipped over the edge of the deck likely means the plane is still mostly intact. These kinds of accidents occasionally happen. Just months ago, a British F-35B fell into the sea in the East Mediterranean. It also just tipped over the edge of the deck and was subsequently salvaged. Allegedly, this image shows its state afterwards, and no big structural damage is seen, even though the plane allegedly sank to the depth of 1 mile. In 2019, the Japanese Air Force managed to lose one of its then brand new F-35As as it crashed into the sea. That happened fairly close to the Russian-controlled Kuril Islands, so an effort was made to recover the wreckage, but the US eventually reported they gave up on looking for the plane. That plane hit the water at high speed, so it likely broke into smaller pieces, and the seabed depth is over 3.5 miles there, so it's harder to search for wreckage that deep, let alone smaller pieces of wreckage. Perhaps the most famous example of a sensitive equipment being fished out was way back in 1976, when a then high-tech and brand new F-14 Tomcat fell off a carrier near Scotland. The US eventually managed to fish it out before the Soviet Union, but allegedly the plane showed evidence of an unsuccessful salvage attempt by someone else by then. So how deep is the South China Sea within the area that was shown? It depends. If it was close to China, then the depth could be as little as half a mile. But going that close to China is a liability that's not really logical for the US Navy to accept. Most likely the US carrier kept to deeper waters, here. Depth in this area is generally 2 to 2.5 miles. While fewer submersibles can go that deep, some still can. When the US Navy was searching for the Japanese F-35 in 2019, it was using a towed sonar locator, which could go down to 25,000 feet or almost 5 miles deep. Commercial salvage ships were hired to help out as well. deep-sea construction ship Van Gogh deployed a robotic drone which could go down to 20,000 feet, or nearly 4 miles deep. China has previously shown it has various exploration and survey submersibles and drones that can operate to depths of some 4 miles. It also has equipment capable of lifting up stuff from quite some depths. Back in May of 2021, China offered Indonesia help to raise their sunken submarine. A Chinese Navy salvage ship was then described as capable of salvage operations at depths of up to 15,000 feet, or almost 3 miles. Another ship deployed submersibles which could operate at depths of up to 6 miles. So it's likely within both the US and China's capability to actually find and lift the wreckage, in theory. But to actually raise the wreckage, several things need to happen. First, the wreckage needs to be found. Deploying deep-sea survey drones takes time, as ships operating them may take weeks to arrive. China is in luck there, as it's close to the area of the accident, and it might need just days to get their ships to the spot. Now, the US Navy could in theory keep a bunch of its own ships over the area the whole time, but A, that would be very expensive, and B, it still might not prevent the Chinese from doing their search. Survey submersibles don't need to be launched from ships overhead. Even the ship with a crane doing the salvage might not have to be directly overhead the plane. Airbags might be used to inflate around the wreckage and then steered as they raise up. Certainly, the fact we're talking about a 15-ton plane rather than a 3,000-ton submarine makes it much easier to fish anything out of the deep. The thing is, if both the US and China are really adamant on getting to the wreckage, there is bound to be considerable political friction. As we said, the carrier most likely was not anywhere near Chinese territorial waters. There is such a thing as an exclusive economic zone, and the fishing resource usage rights to that and fairly close to China at 200 nautical miles of the coastline. But the seabed resource usage can extend to 350 nautical miles, which is already somewhat within the plausible area of where the accident happened. Now, China does claim almost the entire South China Sea to itself in some regards. There's the famous 9-line claim, but in reality China does not enforce that claim. In practice, it's more of a claim to the South China Sea being its area of influence, where it does what it wants. But other countries' ships still pass freely without permits, unlike in China's territorial waters. And the actual international legality of it all is all very undefined, worryingly so. Only international body governing the legality of claims is the UN, and since the 1980s, the UN did not update its laws, which state that every ship must abide by the laws of its respective country if it sails outside the territorial waters of a country. But if it's sunken, laying on the seabed, well, the UN doesn't define that at all. Of course, each country will claim a ship or an aircraft laying on the seabed is their own. Indeed, the US has proclaimed something called the Sunken Military Craft Act, which says that any US military aircraft sunk anywhere in the world, including other countries' territorial seas, is property of the US. But that's just the US position. Other countries, and especially China in a case like this, might not and would not necessarily agree with that US view. There's also the 1974 example of the US salvaging part of a sunken Soviet submarine in international waters. Indeed, the whole issue of legality is so problematic that the Institute of International Law urged that laws be made more clear. However, their 2015 resolution is really a private matter, not recognized at the UN. Many countries are in legal disputes about EEZs and continental shelf exploitation. So there aren't any clear-cut rules to go by. So legally speaking, it could really be a race. Whoever gets to it, gets to keep it. And there was never before an example where something so sensitive sunk to the bottom of the sea, so close to an adversary's coast. China is simply geographically better positioned to get its search subs to the area before the US does, if it knows where exactly the plane crashed. So, if China does attempt to go for the wreckage, there might be quite a political and legal uproar in the US. There might come a situation where US and Chinese ships are both sitting in international waters where both sides are allowed to go right next to each other. And we're talking not just unarmed salvage ships, but also destroyers and other Navy ships protecting them. Tensions might run so high that an incident might turn deadly. Trying to dig out a plane without ships at least close overhead is also possible, but much harder. Basically, it will require a submersible to cut the plane to pieces and then carry pieces away, so the submersible can dock with the ship at a nearby location. It could also be in the US interest that it doesn't want to risk and wait for the salvage operation this close to China. Instead, it might want to destroy the wreckage as soon as it finds it, which might still take weeks until the search submersibles arrive. Also, using explosives might leave some complete pieces of the plane scattered around for China to take. China might learn a lot in the medium term if it gets its hands on the F-35. Who knows if the US is willing to risk that, but if the ships from both sides keep amassing in the South China Sea, a single wrecked F-35 might be the least of our worries.